Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for this week's video lecture. Today we're looking at Strayer's chapter 12, The Worlds of the 15th Century. The image in the background here is a depiction of Christopher Columbus's first encounter with the natives of the so-called New World. And in the opening section, Strayer talks about the historical impact of that meeting. In the first main section of the text, though, he talks about the shapes of human communities and how the lifeways that had developed since the time that humans started migrating around the world, while they become a smaller percentage of the global population, they nonetheless stay the same, including the foragers going back to the Paleolithic era. Hunters and gatherers, they have a history. They're non-literate and non-urban. Nonetheless, their societies did change over time. We just don't have written records of it, but the people were always there and indeed are still there today. In Australia, the Aboriginal peoples manipulated the environment and engaged in relatively long-distance trade networks, indicating a certain degree of complexity. And in the Pacific Northwest of North America, the abundance of food sources allowed for permanent settlements of large houses, social stratification and complexity, and extensive food storage. Strayer uses the term complex foragers, affluent foragers. You'll remember that was the term that Christian used to describe these people who had such an abundant foodstuff that they really didn't need to do a whole lot of moving around. And so while still being hunters and gatherers, they're nonetheless a little more settled. Similarly, agricultural villagers maintained a presence in the world history. These societies had history and a certain degree of social and economic sophistication, but they did not have larger political systems. Instead, they relied on kinship or family systems. One example can be seen in West Africa, the Igbo people of present-day Nigeria. They did not have kings or a state system like their neighbors, but they did engage with trade with nearby kingdoms. And in what is now central New York State, a major agricultural shift occurred. People that had been hunters and gatherers became farmers, and using corn, beans, and squash, their populations grew. The growing populations created conflict and frequent warfare until sometime in the 15th century when an alliance was formed and a truce established. This great law of peace put an end to the bloodshed and allowed for the development of limited government, social equality, and personal freedom. It's worth pointing out, too, that several historians, American historians, have pointed out the influence of the Iroquois Federation on the founding fathers of the United States. Finally, nomadic pastoralists maintain a presence in this era towards the end of the post-classical era as well. We know the Mongols were sort of the height of that. But a Turk from Central Asia named Timur, or Timur the Lane, or Tamerlane, or Tamerlane, you'll all see variations of these. He was the last of the great Central Asian leaders of warrior nomads. His armies attacked and plundered parts of Russia, Persia, and India. He died before they could invade China, however. His descendants maintained control of an important area in Central Asia, that's known as the Timurid Empire. Yet in the coming centuries, most of the Turkic nomads would face imperial expansion from Russia and China, and so get sort of enveloped in civilizations, losing their nomadic lifestyle. In Africa, there's a people called the Fulbe, who are from the upper reaches of the Senegal River. They were nomadic cattle herders who traveled among settled societies. While they paid rent to these settled communities for grazing rights, they held the farmers' way of life in great contempt. They would later convert to Islam, though, leading a series of jihads and establishing their own states. In this map, you can see this is the Timurid Empire in what's Persia. Their key city was Samarkand, a city that was long established, that had been on the Silk Roads. But you can also see this is about 1405. This is when Timur dies. The Delhi Sultanate is still intact. The Ming Dynasty has started, and you can also see these voyages of the Ming Dynasty's expansion into the Indian Ocean trade network. Civilizations by the end of the post-classical era, the majority of the world's populations are living in them. Two of the biggest are China and Europe at the time. In China, we have the Ming Dynasty, who have replaced the Yuan Dynasty. The Yuan Dynasty, remember, is the dynasty of Mongols. Even as they claimed the mandate of heaven, there was a sense that they were culturally not Chinese. And so one particular emperor, Emperor Yongle, sponsored a number of important projects to get China back on track after the Mongols, including public works, building a new capital complete with new temples and courts, overseas missions, and the writing of an enormous encyclopedia. In a move to wipe out the Mongol legacy and rebuild the Chinese state system, Yongle and others promoted Confucianism and the exam system as a form of re-Sinicizing China. Unlike earlier Neo-Confucianism in the Song Dynasty, though, which tried to eliminate the foreign influence of Buddhism, the variety of Neo-Confucianism in the Ming era was not nearly so harsh. As the Ming repaired infrastructure in fields damaged by the Mongols, the state set in motion substantial economic growth. This growth was accompanied by a reinvigoration of maritime trade, especially in the Indian Oceans. One of the most remarkable moments in the Ming Dynasty were the massive fleet sponsored by Yongle and commanded by the Admiral Zheng Ho. For several decades, hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men sailed the China Seas and the Indian Ocean, demonstrating Chinese power. However, this was not a mission to colonize or conquer, but rather a trade mission that encouraged the expansion of the tribute state system. The fleet was suddenly recalled and scuttled in 1430s, and the Ming turned away from sending merchants out into the world and instead let the world come to China. So this was a fateful decision the Ming made to stop their maritime expansion just in a moment when it was really poised to dominate globally. Europe is in a similar situation in a sense, trying to recover. They're recovering after the plague and the demographic catastrophe that it caused in Western Europe. The population began to expand again around 1450. However, the plague had long-lasting social and economic consequences in Western Europe. In contrast to China, Europe was a region divided into many smaller states that were in near constant conflict with each other. The 100 Years' War between France and England serves as an example. Starting in northern Italy, the Renaissance was a revival of Greco-Roman art and philosophy. By focusing on the achievements of individuals and on real-world practicalities, the ideology of the Renaissance, called humanism, was a direct challenge to the otherworldly spiritualism of the church. This map, you can see Europe by the time of 1500 is starting to slowly resemble something like what we would recognize as modern Western Europe. France, you can see, has sort of coalesced. Spain, with the Reconquista, has captured the areas formerly held by Muslims. The area that will become Germany is still kind of fractured, but held loosely together as the Holy Roman Empire. Note here that Italy is still fractured, but you've got the Republic of Venice that has this territory up here. Over here is the Ottoman Empire, who take over this region after knocking off Constantinople and ending the Byzantine Empire. So one of the key comparisons for China and Europe is in their explorations of the seas, maritime voyaging. In 1415, Portugal takes over. The Portuguese state, with the support of the Pope, launched a series of voyages that culminated in Vasco da Gama leaving Portugal for India in 1497. They are very interested in trying to find a route to Asia that doesn't involve them having to go through the Ottoman Empire. Columbus, sailing for Portugal's rival Spain, will reach the Americas obviously in 1492. The most obvious contrast between the two maritime forces was the size of the ships and the fleets. While Zheng Ho had hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men, the Iberians, the Portuguese, and the Spanish sent out a handful of ships with crews of about 100. This showed a dramatic difference in power and wealth. As China was already wealthy, it had no real need to expand overseas, and since China was centralized, the state decided to stop the voyages. It could do so very quickly. The Europeans, on the other hand, were desperate to break into the larger world community. As Europe was divided into a number of competing states, almost all of whom were in competition with the Islamic world, there was a sense that if a state did not take to the seas, it would lose out to its rivals. In Europe, merchants saw economic opportunities, monarchs saw new tax revenues, and the church saw a way to expand the faith. Thus, there were many more push factors in the poorer and isolated Europe than there were in the wealthy and confident China. And here you can see Vasco da Gama's journey. The Portuguese start exploring along the coast of Africa and, of course, figure out that there is a way to go around Africa that allows them access to the Indian Ocean without having to go through this area that is controlled by the Ottomans. So the other big area of influence in terms of civilization is in the Islamic world. Dar al-Islam is a great deal different than it had been earlier. After the fall of the Abbasid Empire, you'll remember that it sort of splits up into a bunch of sultanates. But by the time of the end of the 15th century, the Dar al-Islam is sort of coalesced around four big empires. The biggest of these is the Ottoman Empire. It's one of the great empires in all of world history. Its scale, power, and age, as well as its cultural achievements, place it in the same category as China. While the Crusades marked a period when Christendom was on the offensive against Islam, the Turks built a massive military that ended the Byzantine Empire in 1453 with the taking of Constantinople, making them the heirs to Rome. The Ottoman Turks would then lead a series of military campaigns into Europe, laying siege to Vienna in what's now Austria in 1529. After 1500, the Safavids emerged as a rival to the Ottomans. Based in Persia, they promoted the Shia branch of Islam and thus fueled a sectarian conflict with the Sunni Ottomans. On the frontiers of Islam, sort of on the outside of the heartland, you also have two big empires take place. Islam, as we know, came to West Africa via the trans-Saharan trade. The Songhai Empire was an Islamic successor to previous empires in the region, most notably Ghana first and then later Mali. On the edge of the Muslim world, the Songhai represented Islam but also blended African traditions into their practice and culture. In India, the Mughals brought a rare moment of political unity. Ruling over a mostly Hindu population, they were initially very tolerant of non-Muslims and created a diverse and vibrant cultural world. The Mughals were Turks who came in from Central Asia and established a new empire there. The Muslim empires promoted both expansion of trade and the faith by sending merchants into Southeast Asia and on into China. Sufi mystics helped spread Islam in maritime Southeast Asia, including into the Straits of Malacca, which will eventually become an Islamic city-state or sultanate that became famously wealthy and cosmopolitan thanks to its access to trade and by providing safe and reliable ports. So Dar al-Islam by 1500, it looks a great deal different than it did before. The Songhai in West Africa, the Ottoman Empire in a huge chunk of the Mediterranean, the Safavid in Persia, Mughal Empire in India. Now, the Ottoman Empire have a huge impact in the era before 1450, but especially up to 1453. However, the Safavids and the Mughals and their relationship to the Ottomans, that is an issue we'll take up in much more detail in the next unit after the Christmas break. So we'll get into greater detail with those in a later time. So outside of Afro-Eurasia, we know that there are civilizational developments in the New World as well. Chief among these are the Aztecs. The Aztecs are the inheritors of the tradition in central Mexico, primarily from Teotihuacan. The tribe called Mexica from present-day northern Mexico or southern what's now United States southwestern United States, settled on an island in Lake Texcoco by 1325. Over the next century, they built up their power by military service, alliances, and constructing a massive city. Later, they claimed descent from the more prestigious line of the Toltecs and Teotihuacan themselves. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was a large city of up to 200,000 inhabitants. Set on an island in the middle of a lake, it had canals, causeways, markets, and floating gardens. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they were stunned by the city's sophistication and acknowledged that it was far superior to any city in Spain. The Aztec Empire was a conquest-based state that required tribute from its conquered subjects. Tribute came in the form primarily of foodstuffs and goods for the markets, but it also included elite luxury items and indeed human slaves. Human sacrifice was common in Mesoamerican history, but the Aztecs took it to a new level. The prominent official Tlacaelel, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, Tlacaelel promoted the idea that the god Huitzilopochtli, I do know I'm saying that right, needed human blood to rebuild his strength for his constant struggle with the forces of darkness. Massive ritual sacrifices also performed a political function and impressed the enemies of the Aztecs. Further to the south, in the Andean region, we get the Inca Empire. The Inca were similar to the Aztec in that they were a small marginal group that came to rule a large empire and used previous precedents to justify their rule, but the Inca had a much larger territory than the Aztecs did. The Inca had a much more developed and invasive state bureaucracy system than the Aztecs, who generally left their people alone. The Inca resettled large numbers of conquered people and encouraged the use of Quechua language as the official language. This was the language of the original Aylus who started the empire. The Inca did not require human tribute for sacrifice as the Aztecs did, but they did require a work tax known as the mita system. Some women were taken from their homes, raised as elite, and married off to Incan officials, but most of the people would be contracted to send a son or several sons to do hard labor for a certain number of months per year and in service of the Inca, which is also the word for the Inca leader. While the Incan system was not equal for the sexes, each had their own spheres in a parallel structure. So parallel descent, for example, is where names, titles, and wealth can be given down from father to son, but also from mother to daughter. And in this way, it creates a kind of separate, not quite equal, but more so than some of the civilizations in Eurasia at the same time. In this map, you can see this sort of the state of the world in the New World, so-called New World, before the Spanish arrive. Here you can see the Aztec Empire. It's taken over part of what had been Mayan territory. You've got down here the Inca, and up here, by the way, are these affluent foragers, these people who have so much abundance they don't really need to move, and they actually make settled societies even though they're still hunting, gathering. And over here is where the Iroquois Confederation formed as well. So all of this creates a kind of web of connection. By the end of the 15th century, the sort of old world, if you will, the Eurasian system is pretty set up. The American system is not quite so extensive, but it is generally expanding. And what's holding all of this together? Well, one thing is empires. The political empires of the post-classical period, much larger than those in the classical period. And so the empires themselves have so much contact with each other that creates a kind of connection. Obviously, another kind of connection has to do with religion. The three universal religions by this time have all sort of settled into certain areas of the world. Christianity in the West, Islam sort of in the central part of Afro-Eurasia, and then Buddhism in the East. The old trade routes that had been existed for a long time are still there, and they've all coalesced together in Afro-Eurasia. But then they're also joined by new trade routes, especially maritime routes, that are expanding the reach of that network. In this map, you can see several things. First of all, the effect of religion in uniting different areas of Afro-Eurasia: Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity. Again, the three universal religions have settled into more or less their present spheres of influence now. You can also see how all of these trade routes, the Trans-Saharan, the Indian Ocean, the Silk Road, the Mediterranean, have all now linked up together to form one giant Afro-Eurasian trade network. So, how does that situation lead us to start thinking about the future? This is a really interesting section of the book. It's not one that you need to spend much time on, though, when you're reading. Just skim through it. I'm going to hit most of the highlights of it right here, but again, it's a good exercise to think about some of the issues that we're going to encounter after we get back from the holiday break. First of all, while the trade networks ran deep and were quite large, the globe was not yet connected by the end of the post-classical era. Instead, we've got this split off into what we frequently call the Old World and the New World, but within those, they are very consolidated. Soon, however, the whole world would become linked in what is now an almost inescapable global system, beginning with the Columbian Exchange. Obviously, those two big separate networks get plugged into creating one giant global network. European technological advances would change methods of production, styles of living, and the ability to project power after the 19th century with the rise of industrialization. That's going to have huge consequences also. Human population would grow exponentially and impact other species on the planet like never before. Cities would get larger and more common. People would be more tied into for-profit methods of production, and literacy would spread and open new perspectives on the world. All of these forces made the second great revolution since the agricultural revolution, the revolution of modernity. And in the modern era, we see the unprecedented rise of Europe and the expansion of Europeans. The rest of the world had to decide how to deal with them. Often resistance came to characterize this process. So again, this section, skip over it. Don't skip over it entirely, but skim through it. It's more just of an interesting perspective on some of the things that we're going to deal with in the second semester. This chart, though, is worth thinking about for a moment. If you see here from the year 1000 of the Common Era to 2000, it's quite clear. Here's the end of the post-classical period, depending on which periodization scheme you're using. But you can see there's fixing to be a sharp rise in human population that is going to be part of what we would call the modern revolution. In the reflection section, Strayer raises some pretty interesting questions, which he usually does, about change and chance and contingency. Like, how if one little slight thing went differently, things could be different. While historians want big picture explanations, often luck or individual acts of chance make all the difference. And he's got three specific examples that I think are worth thinking about. The first is the death of Ogadai, who was the most powerful successor to Genghis Khan from the Mongols. And you may recall the Mongols were poised to invade Europe, and they likely would have been successful when Ogadai dies. And as a consequence, all of the Mongol warrior leaders are called back to Karakoram, the capital city of the Mongol Empire, to recognize the state funeral for Ogadai. And so they withdraw all their troops to go to mourn for their great leader. That gives the Europeans, particularly the Western Europeans, time to send emissaries to Karakoram to start trying to bargain for peaceful relationships with them. In fact, that's, if you remember the DBQ that we did, many of those emissaries from the West, that's why they were sent there. Had Ogadai not died, or at least not died at that time, it's very likely the Mongols had conquered Western Europe, and how different would history have been if that had happened? Similarly, in 1433, the Ming Dynasty basically scuttles their fleet. In other words, they just basically abandoned their whole maritime expansion project. And what's remarkable is at that time, they were by far the most powerful navy, and not just in terms of military, but in terms of influence and the ability to travel great distances. Had they not done that, how would things be different? If Zheng Ho, for example, had discovered a way to go around Africa to get to Europe, the Portuguese may never have had that opportunity to do that. Or what if they had decided to start exploring in the opposite direction through the Pacific and had discovered the New World instead of the Europeans? How remarkably different would history be in that event? And the last one is the Siege of Vienna, in which the Ottoman Turks are attacking what's now Austria, and they're attempting to invade Europe and expand their empire into Western Europe. They were eventually held off, but if they had been able to win that, they very likely would have been able to make deep inroads into Western Europe. That obviously would have had dramatic consequences for world history. All these scenarios can provide insights and remind us that history is not linear and has other possible outcomes. And as we move into the review for the first semester exam, it's important to realize how many different possible outcomes could have been. We have a tendency to, when we look back on the past, to think it's just inevitable that it's going to go the way that it does. But of course, if you're there at the time, you really have no idea that that's the case. I want to thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you in class.